So my talk is actually knowing your riverine landscapes. So the thing is, why riverine landscapes? I've been really fortunate to work on a number of riverine landscapes, and a number of years ago, this was pre-COVID when we were allowed to do a lot of things, okay? Not pre-hippie times like Nell and Nikki Sherlin here. I'm not that old. I actually took a plane and went west. I know I'm charming at times. I went west, and this is after some heavy rains. And this is actually a picture of an Australian floodplain landscape. And when I saw this and I took these photographs, I just looked at it and I'm going, that is just absolutely amazing photograph. It's an amazing sight. And I think you would agree with me that that is absolutely amazing. It's amazing for its diversity in the different forms. It's amazing because of the different colors. And I haven't photoshopped or enhanced that at all. That's a picture of the Cooper floodplain taken around about, maybe 6 weeks after a flood went through. Absolutely, and I was really interested in the biodiversity and the response of this particular system. So there we have it again. The interesting thing is that I was only there about 3 or 4 months before that I took that photograph, and that's what it looked like. It hadn't been wet for 12 years, okay? In between times, we had some huge developers who wanted to go out there and develop that country. And one of the things in the EIS was it's actually a barren, non-productive landscape. Yes, it may have been non-productive then, but look at it, but look at it now. So in between periods, we went from this dry, barren landscape to one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. We actually determined the value that we had from that flood, okay? So that's one of the things that absolutely amazed me about our riverine landscapes. So what I want to do is 3 things in this particular talk. Some of the things you'll know already, and you might say, why have we got this idiot up here trying to tell us to suck eggs? But I want to recontextualize it. I want to talk about rivers, riverine landscapes, and their importance, not just for farming folk, for the industry, for urban people, but in general. I want to bring in this notion that we do know that rivers change. Andrew Watson told us this morning, hey, my riverbank was eroding. Yeah, that can be a part of natural change. Rivers do change, and they do change naturally, but that change is actually changing. And I want to examine that and put it in a different context on how we actually manage our riverine landscapes. And the last thing I want to do is talk about a way forward for managing our riverine landscapes, knowing that the way they're changing is actually changing. And I want to bring up this whole idea, of resilience, because I know that this is a part of this particular conference's themes. And resilience means different things to different people. So let's unpack it a little bit, apply it to rivers, and let's see how we can move forward with resilient riverine landscapes. Okay, this is a map of the river system, the global river systems. This is of large rivers. Every single continent on Earth is dissected by rivers. Every single continent on Earth is drained by a system of rivers. This map here is of large river basins. That is, it's got a catchment area greater than 300,000 square kilometres. So that our global system, our global landmass, is heavily dissected by riverine landscapes, okay? So what? There is that amount, nearly 7.5 million kilometres of rivers, streams, okay, that dissect the globe, okay, which has a surface area of nearly 773,000 square kilometres of our global landmass is influenced by river systems, okay? Fresh water. There is over 33 trillion cubic metres of water that's discharged through this river network in any given year, and it's discharged into the oceans. Just remember that one, because the majority of Australian rivers don't discharge fresh water to the sea. They actually discharge water to nowhere, to the inland area. But nevertheless, in terms of the global importance, okay, it distributes that. That is a hell of a lot of Olympic-size swimming pools, you would agree. The next fact, we've got that amount of sediment that has actually been transferred or transported through that riverine network to the ocean. It's your topsoil. That amount of sediment is actually transported through the riverine network, global network, and pushed to the oceans every year, okay? And then as a consequence, rivers are the major distribution pathway of nutrients and other really important biogeochemical elements globally. So rivers take nutrients and other things and take it from one part of the landscape naturally and distribute it somewhere else. So if we don't understand our rivers, we can't understand things about nutrient transfer around our landscapes. Rivers are also the most important pathway for the distribution of biota. And in this particular case, I'm using the example of freshwater fish species. There is over 10,000 freshwater fish species that move around this global network every year. Rivers are important. Okay. Fact number 4. Okay. There are over 3.5 billion people that live within 10 kilometres of a stream, a creek, a trickle, or a river globally. We live close to them. We are connected to them. We influence them. They influence us. Rivers are valuable to society. They are valuable in terms of the ecosystem services. For some people, we call it natural capital. I'm going to be talking about this in a bit more, okay? In terms of the ecosystem services they provide to you and I. In the Murray Darling Basin alone, in a good year, they will provide that amount. $302 million a year in the ecosystem services provided by the streams, the rivers, and the floodplains, okay, that they provide. I'm not talking about industry or agriculture. I'm talking about the natural capital, the natural ecosystem services that they provide. They are important. So some people have just given me, what's he talking about, ecosystem service? What do we mean about natural capital? Okay, there are 4 types of ecosystem services. We've got provisioning, that is the products that we get from rivers and their floodplains. Fresh water, food, natural fibre, nutrients, and genetic resources. You've got things called regulating services, water regulation. Floodplains are the major source of flood control, okay, for systems naturally. You can put a dollar value on that. You've also got climate regulation, water purification, and pollination. They also have cultural value as well. Indigenous cultural value, spiritual value, recreational value. You imagine it. If you want to go fishing for a weekend, you count up what you've got to take. Don't worry about the pellet of beer that you put in the back of the ute, but everything else that's contributed to you going fishing for a weekend, that is all part of a cultural service that's associated with rivers. Okay? And then there are supporting services. Those are services that are necessary to produce other ecosystem services. Soils, and you hear a lot about soils and land care. Okay? Nutrient cycling and primary production. These things are what we call natural capital. We can put a dollar value on them, and they're worth a lot of money, okay, that we tend to forget about at times. So, moving on then to the second part, I think I've told you that rivers are really important, okay? But the thing is, I'm going to tell you now that rivers change. Some of this is going to be obvious, but I'm going to be building upon this. So we do know that rivers change where you are within the landscape. Okay, this is the Upper Namoi. Beautiful, isn't it? Particularly when it's got water in it. Okay, the Lower Murray floodplain, this is down near Blanchetown. Okay, all of these little strips, okay, provide grapes for the red wine that some people like supping on, gentlemen. Okay, and that is actually the Cooper Creek. Completely different types of river systems, different processes, different physical features, and they produce different types of ecosystem services. We know that in Australia as a continent has got some of the most highest diversity of different types of rivers that we see compared to a lot of other places. Okay. A high diversity of river types, therefore ecosystem services, a high diversity. Okay. We've got rivers that run purely over rock. We've got others, that's from the Kimberley, by the way. That there is a set of rivers running through swamp material that has been generated by organisms. Okay, that there is in the Macquarie. And then we've got other rivers that don't just flow in a single channel, they actually move off into the floodplain and then come back again. A high diversity of types of rivers. They change depending on where you are within the broader landscape. They are shaped by different purposes. I want you to remember that because I'll be bringing it up in a minute. Okay, and believe it or not, we actually have rivers that go nowhere. Over 75% of Australian rivers do not discharge water, sediment or nutrients to the ocean. They go inland and finish. They're called endorheic river basins. Special type of river basins, the Cooper, the Bellew, even the Paroo at times, for most of the times, doesn't flow into the Darling and then discharge water into the Pacific. Okay, so not only do rivers change in space, but rivers also change in characteristics and value and processes along an individual river system. You know this inherently, okay? I'm just illustrating it for you. So as we go from the headwaters down to the lowland reaches, rivers change in character. They change in function and they change it in physical character, and therefore in terms of their water chemistry, in terms of their biology, and in terms of their ecosystem services. So we can actually, in the headwaters, we all know, up where George MacDonald lives, way up in Wellabadar, we're up in the headwater area where we have tight valleys, and as we go downstream, the valley gets wider, things happen, we get floodplains, and then in the lower reaches, we have these vast floodplain surfaces. Okay, Associated with those different river zones are different broader processes. So in terms of a typical river system, what we actually say is in the headwater areas, it is the main source zone. It's the source of sediments and water. In the Namoi, for example, 90% of the runoff or the discharge or the flow of water that goes past Narrabri and also then to Walgett comes from 10% of the catchment area. It's up where the McDonald's live in the headwater areas. Most of that water comes from a very small part of the catchment. Not like where you see in the US or Europe, where water is generated evenly across the catchment surface. Okay, and most of the sediment comes from there as well. As you move further down, that is, say, below Tamworth, okay, down to Gunnedah and what have you, the main function of a river is what we call, it's a transfer. Its job is to move water and sediment from the upper areas down through to the lowland reaches. It's a transfer zone, okay? Lower down in the floodplain zone, the main functions there, or processes, all around deposition. It's an accumulating area. So what am I trying to say very awkwardly is that you have different functions depending on where you are within your river system, and those functions then dictate the structure and the organisms and how you can use them sympathetically. Okay. I know this is a busy slide, but let me take you through it. All it is doing is putting a few facts, a bit more facts, on that nice fancy diagram. So we have the source zone, the transition or transfer zone, the floodplain or depositional and accumulation zone. These columns here tell you what the dominant process is in each of those zones. That column there tells you the character of the river that you might see or expect, and that's just a photograph or an example of that. So in the headwaters or the source zones, the main process is the supply of water and sediment. There is a high degree of what we call connectivity between the catchment surface and the river channel. There is also a high degree of connectivity between higher up the river and a wee bit lower down. So there's strong connections. Whatever you do on the catchment is actually going to be reflected within inside the river channel, both naturally and anthropogenically. That is from human interference. Okay? So we have higher energies, and as a consequence, we get larger sediments, a lot of sediment being moved. Further down in the transfer and the transition zone, as I was saying, what you get is quite variable flow and sediment regimes, okay, and the transfer of water. And then in the lower part of our river, it's the accumulation of water and sediment, and the connectivity changes. The influence of catchment processes on the river is diminished, but the connectivity is between the river channel and the floodplain. The characteristics you get in the headwater areas are in size, gully-like, irregular. Some people can say really quite nice looking, not very pretty looking things, okay? And we've got limited floodplains. Further down in the transfer, what you've got is river channels developing that look like really efficient movers of sediment. Okay, you're starting to get some floodplains, but you also start here to get a high diversity of what I call morphological, that's academic speak for physical character. But I'm an academic and I need to use academic words, okay? And then further down in the floodplain areas, no brainer, big extensive floodplains and very fine sediments. So the character of your river system changes as you go along the long profile. And size like high connection with the river, with the catchment surface, sometimes controlled by bedrock or geology. Further down, the rivers start to meander. Okay, you get high diversity of physical characteristics, and then right down in the lowland areas, you can at times get these magnificent big floodplain systems. So the key message here is rivers do change depending on where you are within the landscape, and it reflects that landscape. And that's what we get in the Namoi. Okay, here's the headwater areas. You get a high abundance of headwater systems. Okay, that's just a digital elevation model of the Namoi. And this here is how we've characterized the river zones. These river zones are really important because government policy use those river zones to say what you can and cannot do in them and how they govern them. So this classification comes out of the Murray Darling Basin Authority. Okay, we have headwater areas. They class the headwater areas down to Gunnedah. Some people are going, Gunnedah, huh? Yeah, I know. They're in the upper catchment. Okay, and then you've got this transfer area. Then further down, Narrabri down, is what we call the lowland or depositional thing. Whenever the Murray-Darling Basin Authority or government departments come and do an assessment of rivers, generally they'll link them up in those type of zones. So it's important to understand why. Okay, right. The interesting thing is, not only do our rivers vary depending on where they are, those rivers are actually changing and changing quite significantly. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Why are they changing? We're changing because we're changing the land surface. People in the Namoi Valley know we've got a lot of gullying. I mean, I've seen some really neat gullies around the place. In some parts, gullies can be incredibly deep. That's a class of my students up here looking at this. The first thing one student said to me, and she was from Sydney, oh, how did that get there? Amazing, isn't it? But more importantly, I said, where did that sediment go? Where did it go and what was it doing? Okay? Because that's all in the headwater areas. And the other thing is that we're interfering, we have changed, I'll recant that. We are changing the catchment surface. We're also changing river channels directly through a whole bunch of infrastructure in terms of large dams. These things change sediment supply, the transfer of water. These things here regulate water or movement downstream. So the sediment that's actually eroded out of the enhanced sediment erosion out of our headwater areas, it can end up in some of our dams. So I want to leave you, I wasn't going to say this, but I'll leave you with this little conundrum. If you were, now the efficiency of dams to trap sediment is governed by their size. If you were to increase the height of Dungowan Dam, you increase what we call the trap efficiency of that dam. It's better at trapping sediments. A smaller dam, less efficiency, higher, no brainer. If you increase the height of Dungowan, you are going to become more efficient at trapping sediment. How long would an enlarged Dungowan Dam take to infill compared to a lower Dungowan Dam, even with the same amount of erosion? Or if we put climate change on it, we know that climate change will increase erosion. What would that do? That's a conundrum, and it's something that hasn't been asked in a lot of places. Not only have we changed catchment surfaces, changed the flow of water downstream, but we've done other things with our rivers. We've dug bloody great holes in them, okay, to use the sediment as a resource. The Namoi River was a main source of aggregate sediment for the building industry around Tamworth for a long, long time. You take sediment out of the river. Okay, we also take water out of the river for a whole bunch of purposes. We develop the broader riverine landscape, that is the floodplain. Yes, we put dams on them, we regulate them, but we also straighten river channels as well. So we've done a whole bunch of activities that interfere with our rivers. We're interfering on how they change and how they change naturally. So we're changing the way they change. I don't come from Irish stock, by the way. So that change is influencing the health of Australia's rivers. So in the year 2000, the Australian government undertook the first national survey or assessment of land and water across Australia. I was involved in the River Health Program, and this here is the first assessment of the health of Australian riverine landscapes across the intensive land use zone in Australia. Okay, they are, if you're red and orange, it's poor health. If you're green, dark green and light green, you're quite good. Okay, when I first showed this to my 6-year-old nephew, he goes, "Uncle Marty, the heart of Australia is bleeding." Gosh, I couldn't have said it any better, actually. I really couldn't. It's saying that a lot of the rivers in the intensive land use zone of Australia were in poor condition. Their ability to provide services to you and me has diminished. Okay, well, we've got a little bit better in terms of how we actually assess riverine landscapes. And in that period there, 2008 to 2010, was the last time they've done an assessment of the overall health of rivers in the Murray Darling Basin. It was called the Murray Darling Basin Sustainables River Audit, and I was a part of that team. Okay, that there is the hydrological indicator for the sub-basins. That there's the Namoi, and there's the ratings here. Okay. So the Sustainable Rivers Audit had 5 metrics: hydrology, physical character, fish, other biota, little bugs, and riparian and floodplain vegetation. Okay. The Namoi, and like a lot of other rivers in the basin, were deemed to be very poor overall, but in terms of those metrics. Toowoomba is a way up here. Okay, Gunnedah and will be here. Tamworth, if I can stop shaking, is about there. Okay, Armidale is up in here somewhere. Okay, that there is the Namoi. So it is what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm saying we're not dealing with the natural system, we're actually dealing with a novel system. And I'll come back to that in a minute, okay? So because of that, okay, and look, we've got multiple lines of evidence to show that our rivers are changing, okay? All of those factors. We've got good climate models, land use data, hydrology, all of these ones here. They all indicate that the nature of change has been altered. I just want to pick on one, I just want to choose one of them, my favorite, sediment regimes. Okay, sorry, I'm an academic, I'm a nerd scientist, I'm allowed to deal with my own favorite subject. So what I do is I go out to floodplains and drill holes and what have you, and when you drill a hole or look at an exposure, typically you'll see in floodplains, you get all these little layers. Okay, you've got a beautiful big layer in there. The interesting thing that these little layers are like a page in a book. Each page has a different story. It tells you something about the history or the nature in which the sediments have been laid down. The physical characteristics, the chemical characteristics can tell you how much energy was associated with their movement, the chemistry, where it came from. But not only that, they're also associated with other things like pollen and bugs and grubs that can tell you something about the environment in which each of those layers was put down. Really important. We've drilled so many holes on the floodplains in the upper part of the Murray Darling Basin that if we put floodwaters in them, I'm afraid they just might go down our plug holes. We've got so many of them. So I've used all that sediment information to put together what I call a generalized model. And this is what I want to show you. This is a typical sediment core, extends 2 meters deep, okay? These are the different layers that you actually see. Yes, it might vary from place to place, but this is a general model, okay? And so what I see when I first look at it, this is the key for here. What we actually see is quite a high diversity in sediment that tells me that the environmental conditions in which those sediments were put down has changed over time. We can also date those sediments. Typically, so in our sediments, and how we date them is that we take individual grains of particles, quartz grains, bombard them with light, and then they fluoresce. That fluorescence tells us something about the age at which they're being deposited. So generally, in our cores, we see about 2 meters down, 1700s, here's the 1900s. But what we actually see as we go up this core, there's a change about 1900s. Okay. So what does this mean? I think what we're talking about is pre-European sediments here. And what you actually see is these regular fining upward sequences. The black being mud, these ones here being sand. So what we actually get is these regular cyclic changes in the nature of the sediments. That is, our rivers are changing naturally, but they're doing in some type of cycle. You would agree. Okay. Sediment comes from different parts of the upper catchment. Okay. The rate of accumulation is representative of global natural settings. But what you actually see from about the 1900 is a change in the nature of that sedimentation. We see a chaotic, you don't get these beautiful regular sequences, you get chaotic sedimentation. The province where the sediment is coming from is not a variety of sources. We're starting to be dominated by particular parts of the upper catchment, okay? And accumulation can be up to 80 times natural pre-European levels. What that is saying is the nature of sedimentation, which changed around about this time. Associated with that is also a change in the nature of the nutrients that were being deposited on those floodplain surfaces. Right, how do I try to explain it all in my own tiny little mind and what it means? So here I come to resilience. Resilience is a real buzzword right now. Everybody is resilient. Even Latrell Mitchell is resilient. He come back from injury. Oh my God, the New South Wales Blues may be more resilient in a couple of weeks. We just don't know, okay? So what does resilience, what is it? Resilience means different things to different people. Okay, technically, resilience is that. Really nice. But there are two key parts of resilience. We're dealing with a system, not an individual. We're dealing with many different parts. So in terms of riverine landscapes, we're talking about our catchments, we're talking about our floodplains, we're talking to headwater reaches, transfer lowland reaches. And it is its ability to absorb what we call a disturbance, a flood or something, and retain the same function, structure, and feedback mechanisms, okay? That's what it means technically. Its ability to bounce back, okay? This is another way of looking at resilience. Don't look at me for a minute. Just look at that ball. Concentrate on that ball. Watch that ball going backwards and forwards. And as you're doing, listen to the sound of my voice. And you will get sleepy and sleepy. Gotcha, right? That's resilience. Resilience to me says our system's dynamic. It moves, it changes, and it changes naturally, okay? Resilience is how we look at dynamic systems. Can we understand that? How does it change and why, okay? But resilience is more than that. Resilience also says that we have multiple regimes or states. And what happens with resilience is we will have a trigger or a set of drivers or disturbances that push our river from one state or regime into a new state. When you're in the new state, resilience says you can't go back. It's still dynamic, but it's different, okay? And when you move into a new state or a regime, you get from a river system's point of view, you can get the loss of keystone species like river red gums. You can get what we call ecosystem surprises. That is, our river reacts in a way that wasn't expected. And we get the reduction of ecosystem services. That is the loss of biodiversity. That is, our riverine landscapes are no longer able to produce what they did in the past. We've got data to show that is happening in the Murray Darling Basin. Our rivers are now in a new state, okay? So we flip, we get different structures, we get different functions and different responses. What I'm suggesting to you is that a lot of our rivers are no longer in pre-European riverine landscape conditions. They are anthropogenic riverine landscapes. They're novel. They're novel, and we don't really know how they're going to react to future disturbances, whether that be through climate change or catchment management or river restoration activities, or policy decisions about what we do with our waters and our floodplains. We don't know. Okay, so what does that mean? And we do see unexpected responses. So I'm just going to, this is some stuff that's hot off the press from one of my postgraduate students. What she has done is she has analysed all the restoration projects that have actually taken place in the Namoi over the last 30 odd years. She's actually got a database of over 800 odd projects. We've invested $78 million in restoring. That is, hoping to push our rivers back to where they were. $78 million, okay. There's been no limited monitoring and assessment or an evaluation of those projects. We haven't learnt from them formally. Some of those restoration activities have had unexpected consequences. They haven't done what we thought they would do. To me, that is an indicator that we may well be in a different state, not in a European or a pre-European state. Okay. And what we do know is that less than 40% of the employed strategies or techniques have actually worked with the natural river processes. So if you're in a headwater area, you'd use a different type of strategies to restore your river than if you're in a lowland area. They have to be different because you're an accumulating area, whereas in a headwater area, you're in a source area. So if you look at the types of activities, we've got a limited number of strategies that we've rolled across our riverine landscape and hoped that they'd worked. We haven't got better at doing what we're doing. And I think that is a consequence that we're not aware or know our riverine landscape. And some of the activities, the response to some of the activities have also been unexpected. Okay, so the other thing that we know about a lot of our river restoration activities is there's limited coordination from the entire river system. This is not a criticism on individuals. Some individuals are doing great work, but it needs to be coordinated in a larger strategy to improve the entire health of the Namoi, okay? And a lot of the stuff is trying to restore back rather than saying, can we repair to something that is forward thinking? And a lot of it's site-based, not river-based or river network or systems-based. Okay. So my apologies. I haven't acknowledged Craig Carter for these. He gave them to me late last night, just before I was going to bed, and I'm grumpy at night. Okay. So this is some work that Craig's been doing in the Upper Namoi. Okay. There's a before shot and after shot, which actually shows an increase in vegetation associated with that riverine landscape, associated with that activity. We need to be doing more than just looking at it. We have to actually assess it formally and put it into a bigger strategy, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that worked well. There are others, thank you, George, okay, that have also worked well. But resilience thinking has implications for the way we undertake restoration and address the dip in the health of the Namoi River. Okay, first of all, we have to acknowledge we can't go back. So don't set a target of restoring back to something because you won't do it. You can't achieve that objective. You do something and try to meet an objective. You can't go back using resilience thinking. Okay, so we don't restore, we repair. We repair to something. We can't restore back, we've got to repair for the future. We've got to repair so our systems have the ability to absorb what's coming. Coming in terms of further development in the catchment, coming in terms of climate change, and also what's coming around the corner in terms of policy and governance changes, which will dictate what we can do in terms of policy and procedures. And the other thing is, resilience thinking also puts people firmly in the landscape. So restoration or river repair is not just a biophysical activity, it's a person activity as well. I feel a bit embarrassed by saying that, particularly when a lot of our Indigenous people have been doing this for centuries. It's not saying that we're doing it wrong, it's just that we have a different way of looking at things. Okay, so let me just pause before I go on to the future. What have I said so far? We've got a highly diverse type of river systems in Australia that change from upstream to downstream. They have different processes dominate. We need to be aware of that. Where you are in the river system, that river channel will have different sensitivities to change. So some rivers are more resilient or places than others. Our rivers have changed as a result of human interference. I believe that that is permanent. That means we can't restore back. Okay? What resilience thinking does is contextualizes these changes and these responses, okay? And we can't reverse. We've got to be looking at repairing towards something in the future. Okay, resilience provides a way for managing in the future. It's not just a buzzword. Okay. So, I believe that we're dealing with an Anthropocene landscape, It has implications for those things, okay? And the future, we need to be looking at the future of our rivers and our riverine landscapes, which includes our floodplains, through the lens of resilience, okay? An approach. Resilience is also an approach to living with change and uncertainty. It's forward-looking. The big thing is, if we're dealing with river management, okay, we need to be building capacity in our riverine landscapes so they have the ability to absorb what's coming in the future, not restoring back, okay? We need to be, in our management strategies, we need to be preventing further flips or tips into other regimes, because when you do, you lose productivity. Every time you change state, you lose productivity. Agricultural productivity, but also natural capital, ecosystem services, okay? Resilience also builds a bridge between rivers, people, industry, culture, urban, rural. It forces you to do that, okay? So let's just pick on river restoration. We need, if we were looking at river restoration, we go, no, it's not restoration anymore, it's river repair. That's the focus. And you're saying what we're trying to do is actually assist our rivers to absorb the next big flood, okay? So we're looking at activities that will vary between river zones. You can't use what George does and Wayne and Craig in the upper regions and apply it to lowland rivers, okay? We've got to use those, vary those activities that buffer against future stuff. There must be maintenance activities. It's amazing when you look at the 830 restoration projects that we've evaluated in the Namoi. What was surprising is that only 3 of them had money in the budget for formal monitoring. None of them had money for ongoing maintenance. You do ongoing maintenance on your farm. You do ongoing maintenance in your car. Well, if you've seen the state of George's car, you'd probably argue maybe not, okay? But you do. So why aren't you doing it for the repair of your rivers and your landscape? And the other one is monitoring, evaluation is essential. Some form of data gathering is essential. It's essential for people like me, so I can use that data to build a model to help you then do it better. Restoration or repair needs to have a regional strategy. It needs to be focused on building various types of models, and it has to have a learning focus. The definition of madness is doing the same thing, hoping you're going to get a different result. We're better than that. Okay, so what I've said in terms of resilience is both a property of river systems, and that's all about how things change. Resilience, I'm hoping I'm getting to you, is all about an approach to living with rivers with uncertain futures. Really, this is the domain of what we call human natural capital combined systems or socio-ecological systems. It's just people living in harmony with the landscape. But resilience is also a way of managing those systems as well, okay? Up front is going to be around stopping flips. It's about transforming, but a big one is the co-generation of knowledge. That's where we all contribute to how we learn about how rivers respond to things. How do we co-generate knowledge? Okay. To me, the focus has to be on people in the landscape. The strategies have 3 types of strategies. How can we help our rivers absorb things? How can we help them adapt? And how can we transform the way we interact with them? And the approach really is around this co-generation and collaboration of knowledge to actually do these things. Okay. There are many different ways of collaborating. The most dominant way in Australia is what I call purchaser provider. You give me money to do something, and I'm going to give you the information. okay? You employ someone to put buddy nutrients on, or topsoil, or nutrients on your property, and then he does it, and away we go. Purchaser, provider, dominates. There is another way, and that is what we call a co-generation knowledge collaboration, where we get teams of people, including researchers, communities, managers, what have you, that generate the questions together and then go about answering the questions together. It's not the man with the money that dictates what's going on, it's the collective that does. Hairy audacious? No, not really. Okay, so the essence of good collaboration, co-generating, the essence is mutual benefits all the way through to sharing of data. Andrew Watson, he came up with all this data, and I'm going, great, here is the beginnings of it all. The benefits are not only to individuals, you get access to resources, techniques, okay, all the way through to organizations. Communities are also organizations, okay? And the way we go about it is managing it as a collective. We manage the boundaries, the expectations, all the way through to good project governance, and we've actually got to dare to fail. Queensland does it constantly in rugby league. They produce, what the hell did they pick him for? And then they come out with a blinder. New South Wales are just so goddamn conservative because they don't dare to fail. Hopefully it will change. Notice I'm not saying anything about rugby union. Strategic collaborations, okay, and that's what we're talking about, strategic collaborations. It's all about building our knowledge base. Why did it do what did it do? How can we actually make it better? It's that, but it's also about building capacity in regions as well. It's about enhancing people's access to data, to knowledge, but also allowing them to ask questions that people go about answering. Okay, so a collaborative model is a model that is being developed in the region, in the Namoi, in the Upper Namoi, and it's called the Water and the Landscape Initiative. To some of you, it may be called WiLi, but for me, it's WiLi. Okay, this is the WiLi initiative. It's a rethinking of water stewardship and how it relates to riverine landscapes. Okay, it's been developed over the last 24 months through a whole collection of various activities. The WiLi has actually had a number of water forums, okay, a number of workshops, on-ground meetings, and there have been joint project funding applications to actually look at how we manage water in the landscape and our rivers better, our riverine landscapes better. Okay, it's working with and for the community. We're looking at current and future issues of water in the landscape. We've got a steering committee. We've got over 20 registered partners, both industry, local government, state government, but also individual landholders and people from universities, okay? It's got a focus on research and training. I urge, if anyone is curious, to sign up to WiLi, get involved in shaping the riverine landscapes of this particular region. So, to me, the challenge is, I think, by 2030, we're living in an Anthropocene state, okay? And the thing is, if you recognize that from a resilience perspective, the same approaches that cause those problems can't be used to answer them. We've got to be thinking outside of the square. And the whole idea is to avoid system collapse. That is, we've changed from one regime to another. We don't want to go to another one that have reduced productivity. It will require greater money invested in it to maintain that productivity anyway. I think that the response is the development of new approaches, collaborative models that are associated with people and how they interact with our riverine landscapes. We do need new conceptual frameworks and models to understand how we're doing it. We will. We're daring to fail. Come on, Queensland. No. Come on, the riverine landscapes in the New South Wales. We need new modes of learning and communication about how we address those future issues around our riverine landscapes. This is not pie in the sky, because if we don't, we're going to actually leave this one to the person in the middle, unfortunately. We can be smarter than that. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, it was about the finances, really, of, you know how, say, at the moment they've got a $75,000 grant for fixing up properties that have been devastated by water and that. And you mentioned that that you don't see any ongoing looking at the way things have happened sort of in the future sort of thing to that through that process. So I'm just wondering, you know, a government sort of at this stage is you have to spend that 75,000 and you don't get to look at what might happen in the future. So that small amount of money that might be able to be used for that is not there. And I think people sort of spend it and then forget, you know.
Well, we're often forced to spend it and forget. So there's no, we're talking about money for monitoring and maintenance, aren't we, really?
Mate, that's a brilliant question, but also a great piece of insight. So basically, in terms of disaster, okay, what we do is government rushes in and says, here you go, fix it. Okay, and then once they've thrown all that money at you, and if there's any government people in the room, I'm not apologising, by the way, they throw money at you to fix it of what's actually happened, rather than saying, okay, what was the actual cause? So the flooding on the Liverpool Plains from the last flood, where did that water come from? It actually came from upstream, okay? And what we do know, the evidence would show that runoff is not only more water coming out of a rainfall event, but it runs faster. So how come there's not money going into slowing the flow and rehabilitating those upper catchment surfaces that actually prevent you getting flooded out and getting $75,000 every year? It doesn't make sense. So to me, that is a systems approach which is pushed through a resilience perspective. You can keep on doing it. I mean, I've got to go to the coast, Lismore, okay? That flooding and the disaster there was horrendous. It's not the first time it's happened, but we know that the disasters in Lismore are getting more and more serious. Okay, same rainfall event, but the disaster is getting worse. Okay, and so what are they doing to tackle the cause of it rather than the response? So the response was really, I'm not mitigating the response, the 75 grand to help people out. What I'm saying is you really do need to be looking at the cause of things as well. And this is where land care plays such an important role in that.
Hey mate, and thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask about one of the last things you mentioned was the Water in the Landscape Initiative. And you mentioned that you work with a few different groups and organisations through that. Do you actually, with the steering committee, do you have connection with the TOs, the traditional owners as well?
Yes, we do, and thank you very much for that question. So we have two sources of Indigenous input at the present point in time. One is through Mark Sutherland, who is a councillor here in Tamworth. And at my institution, we have the Orala Institute, which is an Aboriginal-based institute, First Nations institute that are also advising us, and those two groups are working. One of the things that we have got planned, okay, if I'm allowed to, is that we wish to have a First Nations water forum. First one in the country that we would like to do here. Yeah, love to talk to you about it afterwards. Thank you very much for that.